Welcome back to Naked History Debrief, the companion show to the main Naked History episodes. This is the place where we loosen the tie, unbutton the top button of the historical record, and rummage through all the little weird details, side roads, and fascinating leftovers that didn't quite fit into the main story. I'm Dyllan Gasaway, and this week we're going to be riding shotgun still with America's most stylish aviation mystery. The man, the myth, the clip-on tie, D.B. Cooper. Or, as we talked about in the main episode, technically Dan Cooper, the name on the ticket. Because history is rude sometimes, and one of the most famous aliases in American crime was basically born because the media tripped over the facts and just kept on jogging. And honestly, that feels weirdly appropriate for this story. Because the Cooper case is one of those rare historical mysteries that lives in the sweet spot between documented fact and total folklore. There are receipts, there are witness statements, there's a plethora of FBI paperwork stacked all the way to the heavens, and there's literal physical evidence that was left behind, and yet the deeper that you go, the stranger that it gets. The more that you learn, the less the whole thing feels like a solved event, and the more it starts to feel like America accidentally invented its own modern folk outlaw. So today, in the debrief, we're going to be digging into the odd scraps left on the cutting room floor. The things Cooper asked for, the things he left behind, and the theories that refused to die, and why this case has lingered so stubbornly in the public imagination for more than half a century. So settle in, keep your briefcase visible at all times, and maybe don't accept bourbon from a mysterious man in a business suit. Let's get into it. Alright, so let's start with Naked Regrets, the section where we get to unpack the strange little morsels, clarifications, and the bonus bits that didn't make it into the main episode, or that deserve a second look now that the cabin pressure has dropped a bit. One of the most fascinating things about the hijacking is that Cooper's demands were oddly specific, but not in a way that screams cinematic mastermind. They were practical. He wanted $200,000 in $20 bills, which, adjusted for inflation, is obviously much more money today, but at the time it was a number that was huge enough to matter and small enough to be realistically assembled quickly. And that matters. If he had asked for some cartoonish fortune, the delay alone might have ruined the plan. Instead, he asked for something large but feasible, which suggests he had thought not just about extortion, but about logistics. And that's true of the parachutes, too. 4 parachutes is one of those details that has fascinated investigators and amateur sleuths forever. It may have been a psychological move much more than a practical one. The thinking has long been that by asking for 4, Cooper may have been trying to make authorities assume he intended to take a hostage with him. If law enforcement thought that he might force a crew member to jump alongside him, they'd be less likely to sabotage the parachutes on purpose. It was a way of making the people on the ground play this a little bit more straight. Which is grim, but clever. And then there's the drink. I love that this story contains the detail that he ordered a bourbon and soda, because it gives the whole thing a bizarre, adult, professional casualness that makes it even more weird. Most hijackers, one imagines, should at least have the decency to look rattled, but Cooper does not behave like a man whose pulse is trying to file for divorce. He behaves like a traveler mildly inconvenienced by the boarding process. And there's also the matter of the tie. Cooper left behind a black clip-on tie and tie clasp on the plane, and that tie became one of the few tangible objects connected directly to him, which is extraordinary because for decades this crime was less crime scene and more haunting suggestion. The tie was a real thing, a very stubborn thing. A piece of matter that said, no, a person was here. And the tie itself helped drive later waves of renewed interest, because particles found on it led to researchers speculating about the kinds of industrial environments Cooper might have worked in. That doesn't mean the tie solved the case, and it didn't, but it did what physical evidence often does in unsolved cases. It keeps the imagination anchored just enough to keep it spinning. And one other detail that always gets me is how quickly folklore overtook fact. The FBI had a real investigation. There were real field offices, real suspect files, real witness descriptions, and very real efforts to trace the ransom money through serial numbers. And yet, almost immediately, the story began shedding the texture of a normal crime and picking up something shinier and stranger. Part of that is because Cooper committed the perfect historical offense. He disappeared at exactly the point where the story becomes visually irresistible. We can picture the stairs lowering, we can picture the storm, we can picture the tie abandoned on the seat, and we can definitely picture the dark shape of a man stepping into weather and the night. And once you can picture something that clearly, your brain starts to finish the movie. And that is where myth enters. Because unsolved cases don't just remain open, they mutate, they gather tone, they absorb wishful thinking, and they attract projection. Some people want Cooper to be a criminal mastermind. Some want him to be a fool who died the second he hit the storm. Some want him to be a disgruntled veteran, and some want him to be a phantom with military training, engineering, and know-how, and the nerve endings of a refrigerator. Everybody builds the Cooper that they prefer, which, to be fair, is also how people use historical ambiguity in general. You give humans a gap in the record, and they will absolutely redecorate it. And then there's the money part of after this. Years after the hijacking, some of the ransom cash had turned up. It was degraded and buried along the Columbia River, which is one of those discoveries that feels like it should solve the mystery, and instead somehow it makes it way worse. Because if the money had never appeared, you could imagine almost anything had happened to it. If all of it had turned up in one coherent, explanatory way, maybe the story narrows. But a little bit of money decayed and partial and disconnected? Well, this is just enough evidence to deepen the mystery while also insulting everyone involved. It's the historical equivalent of the universe just shrugging. And finally, one small but very important emotional detail, the crew. The stories like this can become so wrapped up in the mystery man that we forget that there were actual people on the plane living through a very terrifying event. Their composure, memory, and testimony shaped almost everything we think we know about the case. They had to read him, react to him, survive him, and then spend years being asked to relive one of the strangest nights of their lives while the rest of America turned the hijacker into a legend. And it's worth remembering, because history loves a charismatic mystery, but it usually is other people who have to carry it. And for another segment this week is going to be Conspiracies and Curious Claims, because the D.B. Cooper story is basically a magnet wrapped in conspiracy foil. And I think the most interesting question of this story is not who was he, but it's why do we keep wanting him to be someone specific? Because this case has generated a parade of suspects so long and so colorful that at some point it starts to resemble America's most suspicious talent show. There have been ex-paratroopers, engineers, veterans, convicted criminals, men with grudges, men with weird alibis, men whose relatives became convinced after one too many holiday drinks that Uncle Whatever had that look about him. And look, some suspects are more plausible than others, some details are genuinely intriguing, and some seem to have gotten traction mainly because humans are helpless in the presence of coincidence plus a trench coat. But the larger pattern matters more than any single suspect. People want Cooper to resolve into a type. They want him to be the competent military man who planned everything, or the bitter anti-hero sticking it to the system, or the doomed amateur whose legend is bigger than his skill, or maybe even an escaped nobody who pulled off the impossible because institutions are more fragile than they look. Each theory says so much about the people choosing it rather than it does the case itself. And this is where Cooper turns from mystery into folklore, because folklore loves a figure who is both specific and unknowable. You have Robin Hood, you have the man in the iron mask, the stranger on the road, the outlaw who leaves behind just enough evidence to remain concrete, while never giving enough to become ordinary. Ordinary is the death of a legend. And Cooper never became ordinary. He stayed suspended in that perfect zone of maybe. Maybe he was highly trained. Maybe he was bluffing. Maybe he survived. Maybe he died within 10 minutes. Maybe the money on the riverbank was a clue, or maybe it was a red herring from the cosmos itself. Maybe the tie means something, or maybe it means less than people want it to. What's striking is that the FBI eventually did redirect active investigative resources elsewhere, and yet the public absolutely did not move on in the same way. Private investigators kept digging, documentaries kept airing, and new suspect books kept appearing. Amateur analysts kept dragging topographical maps and weather data into the living room like they were about to solve the zodiac between dinner and bed. And again, this makes sense, because the Cooper mystery scratches a very particular cultural itch. It is a crime story without the ugliness people usually associate with the true crime spectacle. There is a threat, yes, a very real threat, but there is no known murder at the center of the event. The passengers were all released. The image of Cooper is controlled, almost mannered. He does not read in any particular memory as chaotic evil. He just reads like a ghost in office attire. And that makes him strangely easier for people to romanticize. Honestly, probably too easy. Because beneath all the myth, and let us be very clear, this was still a hijacking. Real people were terrorized, and the flight crew had to sit inside a floating crisis while a man with what appeared to be a bomb dictated the terms of their evening. The fact that the mystery later picked up glamour should not erase the fear at the center of it. But history does this a lot, especially American history. We sand the rough edges of certain outlaws, and we turn criminals into symbols. We take danger, add distance, and remove the smell of sweat and fear, and end up with a story that feels almost playful. Cooper is the perfect example. He became less of the man who committed a federal crime and more enigmatic folk phantom who outwitted the machine. And maybe that says something uncomfortable about us. Maybe Americans in particular have a soft spot for figures who exploit a system we already suspect is too large, too impersonal, too arrogant to notice its own weak points. Maybe Cooper survives in memory because he jumped not just from a plane, but through a crack in the national psyche. He vanished into weather, and we projected a fantasy after him. A fantasy of escape. A fantasy of reinvention. A fantasy of getting away clean. The fantasy of outsmarting institutions and never having to answer follow-up questions. Which, frankly, sounds incredible. Historically messy, ethically bad, but conceptually, I get why people latch onto it. And that may be the real reason no final suspect has ever satisfied the public imagination. A solved Cooper is just a man. Maybe a flawed one, maybe a frightened one, maybe a lucky one, or maybe just a dead one. But an unsolved Cooper, that's a legend. And legend has much better staying power than paperwork. And now it's time for This Week in History, the segment where we take a quick little stroll through the historical attic and pull down a few events from the same stretch of the calendar. Some are world-changing, some are weird. It's all worth a look. So April 6, 1917 was the day that the United States formally entered World War I. After years of trying and increasingly failing to stay out of the conflict, President Woodrow Wilson had campaigned on neutrality, but unrestricted submarine warfare by the Germans, rising tensions, and the Zimmermann telegram finally dragged the U.S. into the war. It marked a major turning point in not just the conflict itself, but in America's growing role on the world stage. So if you enjoy the 20th century being loud, complicated, and deeply stressful, this was one of the moments that really got the engine going. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Now, this is not technically the end of the Civil War in one neat cinematic instant. History loves paperwork too much for that, but it was the symbolic collapse of the Confederacy's most significant military force and one of the clearest signals that the war was truly winding down. It remains one of those dates that feels heavy the second you hear it, because it stands on the edge of both relief and reckoning. On April 10, 1912, the Titanic set sail from Southampton on its maiden voyage. This is one of those historical facts that feels drenched in doom even before you finish saying it. At the time, of course, the Titanic was a marvel. It was unmatched in engineering, luxury, confidence, modernity. It was all wrapped into one giant floating statement of human ambition. History, being history, however, took one look at all that confidence and said, "Oh, that's cute." On April 11th, 1970, Apollo 13 launches. A mission that started as just another moonshot became one of the most famous survival stories in space history. Oxygen tank explosion, frantic improvisation, world-class engineering, and 3 astronauts trying very hard to not become a cautionary tale in the vacuum of space. And that date hits with a little bit more electricity right now, because NASA's Artemis II is currently flying a crew around the moon after launching on April 1st, 2026. It is the first time humans have headed back into lunar space since Apollo 17 in 1972. Which means, for the first time in over half a century, the road back to the moon is not just theoretical anymore, it's happening. And speaking of more space, on April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin becomes the first human in space. Only one orbit around the Earth, and it took less than 2 hours, and suddenly the human story was permanently bigger than the planet. The space race was already underway at this time, but Gagarin's flight made it real in a way that nothing else had. For the Soviet Union, it was a triumph. For the rest of the world, it was awe mixed with existential whiplash. One minute, humanity was arguing over borders and grain prices, and the next, someone has looked down at the whole Earth from above. Rude, honestly, and perspective like that changes the mood. And because history occasionally has a sense of humor, and to celebrate the starting of the season of Major League Baseball, on April 8, 1974, Hank Aaron hits his 715th home run, breaking Babe Ruth's long-standing record, which was not just a baseball milestone, but a cultural one. Aaron achieved it under enormous pressure and amid horrific racist abuse, and the dignity and endurance he showed through all of it remains as significant as the record itself. Sometimes history is made with treaties, sometimes it's made with revolutions, and sometimes it's made with just one swing of the bat. And that's it for this week's Naked History Debrief. If you came here wanting to hear the clean answer to who D.B. Cooper really was, well, welcome to the club. We've got some jackets, there's a bulletin board, and somewhere someone is holding a map talking about wind conditions with the intensity of a man trying to win back custody. But that's what makes this story so durable. Not just the hijacking, not just the jump, not just the money. It's that Cooper landed, or didn't land, in that rare place where history and myth can't quite be separated anymore. And once a story gets in there, once it finds that seam between undocumented fact and public imagination, it can live for a very, very long time. So if you enjoyed this debrief, make sure to follow Naked History wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a rating, leave a review, send the episode to that one friend you know who would absolutely fake their own death badly. And until next time, keep asking those questions, keep pulling at those loose threads in the historical record, and remember, sometimes the most powerful thing a mystery leaves behind is not an answer, it's atmosphere. So thank you again, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Until next time, I have been Dyllan Gasaway, and this has been Naked History. Thank you so much for listening. Have a good one.